Well, we'll try this again and see if I can get the video. I've tried twice this morning and it's cut off at about 3 minutes, so we'll start over. So we're going to do a couple of things today. Hopefully, I've got a lot, planned, and I'll see what I can get through. We've been looking at Matthew's birth narrative, and here's what we want to try and get our heads wrapped around. Okay. The first Gospel, Mark, written around the time of the Great War, 70 to 71, right in there, 72 perhaps at the latest, and reflects that war, has no birth narrative, just begins with John the Baptist. The fourth Gospel, as we've noted, does not have a birth narrative as such. It does have that definitive statement about the Logos becoming flesh, but no birth narrative as such. And we know that Luke has one that's quite different than the one in the Gospel of Matthew. So we've seen this, and we've started looking at some of the things that are happening in Matthew's Gospel. We noted the assertion of Allison and Davies that we're dealing here with a very clear Davidic theme in the genealogy. We've also noted with Amy Richter that this narrative incorporates within itself a number of themes that deal with the theodicy problem, the fall, the problem of the Henochic worldview, that is, that evil comes when fallen angels happen. And that's one answer to the problem of theodicy. And so this writer is going to go back and use these great figures of salvation history in his gospel. And so, for example, we noted that the word dream occurs 5 of 6 times here in Matthew. And other than that, dreams only occur sporadically in the book of Acts and really nowhere else in the New Testament. So these 5 dreams here in the birth narrative, I mean, that's where it's all compacted, have a particular function because the dreams are part of this apocalyptic imagination that's found in the Henochic worldview, and dreams are a way by which God reveals God's self, and there are dream and vision sequences both in the Henochic literature. When we come to this, we're dealing with a writer that's very Jewish. He's immersed in his traditions. And if we don't grasp this, if we don't know the traditions, then Matthew's Gospel is easily read in a rather superficial fashion. And we don't want to do that. We want to honor this writer's scribal abilities. In the same way we honor the writer of the fourth Gospel when we are willing to allow particularly historical critical scholarship to help us ferret out the potential backgrounds and allusions that the writer is referring to. And so we've begun that process by using the older scholarship of Krister Stendel with regard to these formula quotations that we saw in the narrative itself, each time expressing some event in which prophecy was fulfilled. And it's certainly possible. Now let's deal with a couple of potential issues here. I hope to get to reading in First Enoch today. I want to show you something about the Henochic worldview. I just wanted to read some chapters. I might ask you to read them on your own if we don't have time, and you can Google First Enoch online and you can read these chapters. So if we don't get to it, I would like you to begin with chapter 105 and read through chapter 108 in First Enoch. It's older translations you'll find online. If you have the Charlesworth translation, that's best. But you'll just get familiar with that. So you can read First Enoch 105, 6, 7, and 8. That's the end of the last book of Enoch, of the 5 books. It's the conclusion. But it has some important things in relation to both the birth narratives as well as the larger worldview of the Gospel of Matthew. So we're in this world where we know that the post-Antioch situation has brought a major influx of refugees from the war, from down south up to Antioch. We know there's a large Jewish community in Antioch and a solid Jewish Christian community as well that will produce, as I mentioned a little later, not only Ignatius of Antioch as the bishop, who of course writes a series of letters as he's on his way to martyrdom around the year 117 perhaps, just a few years prior to the publication of the pastorals, and I would suggest Luke, not the Gospel of Luke, but the book of Acts, which are separated by perhaps 30, 40 years. At any rate, Antioch will also produce a school of thought that becomes a hermeneutic of sorts in the early church, in contrast to that found in Alexandria. The allegorical school of Alexandria will be contrasted with the more literal reading of the text, the biblical text, the Jewish scriptures in particular, but then later also influencing the copyist tradition in Antioch, 2nd and 3rd centuries. It's a major Christian center. And so from the days of prior to Paul through Paul and on, Antioch is a very important place. It produces a number of important figures in the early church. So before we launch into then some of the issues related to the birth narrative, let's deal with two thorny subjects. Let's deal with the historicity of the text. Does it really matter? Does it really matter? Let's go back and take a cue from Dietrich Bonhoeffer at this point in his Letters and Papers from Prison, who accuses Karl Barth of a positivism of revelation because in the first and second volumes, in particular, of the Church Dogmatics of volume 1112, Barth is rather insistent on the virgin birth as a fact, a datum of the Christian faith. And Bonhoeffer says, Karl Barth wants us to swallow everything, the Trinity, the virgin birth, lump sum, boom, down the hatch it goes, or nothing at all. Well, he'll have nothing at all. And he uses the German phrase, friss Vogel oder stirb, eat bird or die. It just means Barth wants you to have all these great doctrines, just eat them or you have nothing. And Bonhoeffer's got a bit of contention with this. Bonhoeffer, of course, is trained in the more liberal tradition, even though he's a Barthian. He's a liberal Barthian during his time. And there were a lot of conservative Barthians, and so Bonhoeffer's on the fringe of the Barthians, is trained by Harnack and Seeberg and others at the University of Berlin, and he questions, is it right for us to have to swallow the virgin birth? Well, if you are a Roman Catholic and you're listening to this, it is important. It's a dogma of the church that the virgin birth is, an historical event. There's something there. It's in history. There's a das to it. And if you're in conservative traditions, of course, a virgin birth is very important as well. Historical, that it actually happened, this way, within space and time. Okay. You see, that's fine. You're quite welcome to read the text this way. But it does you no good in the long run if all you're trying to do is parse the metaphysics of it. And ask all kinds of questions of the text that the text does not even begin to suggest answers to, let alone raise questions for. How did God become human? How human was Jesus? How divine was Jesus? How did this happen? And all of what divine attributes did he give up, and this and that and the other, and all the silly debates that have gone on in Protestantism in and around these topics for 400 years. It's useless, trivial debate. The text does not move in that direction when it refers to a virgin birth. In fact, so much so that Matthew's gospel doesn't mention a virgin birth. It simply mentions that the birth of Jesus Christ was in such a way that it's a presupposition. That is, Mary's betrothed to Joseph before they came together. She's found to be with child by the Holy Spirit, and then Joseph receives all the dreams. Mary's a presupposition. The virgin birth is, and this is something that Ulrich Lutz points out, and if you want to know and probably the commentator that you can really rely on all the time, Ulrich Lutz. Here's his little book called Matthew's History, Interpretation, Influence, and Effect. I recommend this book for a number of reasons. It's short, easy to read, but it's got a lot to do with the way that I've learned to read text. So you'll want to read Lutz. It's very, very good. He also has, in the New Testament Theology series, the Theology of the Gospel of Matthew. Again, a very small, thin book, easy to read. Then, if you want to go further, it's now, I believe, in the Hermeneus series, his books, but here's his commentary on Matthew 1 through 7, and it continues. This is the older edition. I think, again, now it's in the Hermeneus series, where you can get the rest of this. But it's an excellent, excellent treatise. One of the things Lutz is able to do is to point out that even if one wants to say that the writer has created this historical novel stuff that we talked about yesterday, nevertheless, there is some basis for a tradition. Different pieces of this text will contain what appear to be bits and pieces of tradition. One of those is that Mary was betrothed to Joseph and found to be with child. And so the one way to look at a text like this and explain it is to say that Joseph was not the father, God was the Father, and that's the role of the Holy Spirit to come upon Mary and create this child who that will then be called Emmanuel, God with us. That's certainly how the writer of Matthew seems to understand this, but all the emphasis in the story is then on Joseph. It's a patriarchal narrative, friends. I mean, we understand this. This fellow is a first-century Jewish scribe, but we know that he's patriarchal. It's okay. We don't have to freak out about it. And the series of dreams that are then given to Joseph, of course, are going to follow a certain ancient Near Eastern pattern that we find in stories about dreams, as we do in the examples of Abraham, where there are these 3 or 4 different steps that occur in all these dream sequences. There's the command given in the dream, there's the obedience, and then there's the following through. And these 3 things always occur, and they occur here in this text this way too. Now this is one way to solve this problem of saying, okay, so Matthew's, created this narrative out of tradition, but he's also seeing that this history is a promised history. That is, there's a fulfillment of these various things. And of course, it's notorious that he will use in his first fulfillment quotation the Septuagint text, which uses the Greek term parthenos with regard to, behold, a virgin shall conceive. The Hebrew simply has alma, a young woman shall conceive. The writer is just referencing a young bride at that point. The Greek text has sexualized a young woman into parthenos, where Hebrew has a word for virgin. I want to say it's betula, but I'm not remembering perhaps quite correctly off the top of my head. Hebrew has that word already. The Septuagint translators wanted to make sure that these young women were virgins in the Septuagint translation of Isaiah, as is common custom. And of course, Matthew's going to pick up on the Septuagintal quotation here. And there's debates about this already in the 2nd century between Jews and Christians, and the Jews note that it's alma in the Hebrew text and not necessarily, betula or parthenos in the Greek. So does Matthew, have some kind of a core here of a story where this birth that takes place has this component where God engages this particular couple? It's certainly possible. But he has certainly gone on to create some of this narrative as this fulfillment from prophecy. So, for example, as I pointed out earlier, the slaughter here that Herod allegedly conducts is not found in Josephus, and something like this would have made, I think, Josephus's greatest hits of Herod's atrocities. It certainly would have. There are plenty of. That is a great one. I forget which commentator observes that, again, recorded by Josephus, Just before Herod dies, he has a son from every leading family slaughtered so that people would mourn at his funeral. He wanted to bring weeping upon the nation. So again, a story like this is in Matthew about Herod slaughtering young children is not out of character for Herod. You have to understand that. It fits Herod's character. Okay, this is the kind of king Herod was. But did this actually happen? Is it necessary that it actually happened? You understand the question I'm raising? But then, what's the point of it in the whole text? Well, there have been a recent spate of books written in and around Matthew and Empire. And I think we certainly see here that while Empire is not Roman, it is Herodian. And there had continued to be issues, not simply from in Matthew's time, but all the way going back to the Maccabean era about the kingship. Because once the Maccabean dynasty lost its hold, you know, in the would be the late 1st century BCE, and eventually Rome would have to come in and establish a procurator there in Jerusalem after they invaded in 63 BCE to kind of to bring some peace to the land, the Pax Romana. What we find then is Herod, around 25 years later, a quarter century later, becomes the king. He becomes the king for a long period of time, and his sons will succeed him on in through Jesus and Paul's time. But this Herodian dynasty is like any other major significant dynasty. It's full of palace intrigues and bloodshed. I mean, it's you just think 300 and something years later, Constantine will have his own son Crispus murdered. This is Constantine the Saint. Well, Matthew is definitely not a fan of the Herodian dynasty. And so there are these certain ways that this writer is going to be punching holes through that. And one of those ways is through the use of the title Son of David that is already found at the very beginning in 1:1, where the writer says, the beginning, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, that is the Biblios Genesis, the book of Genesis, the Genesis book of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and then begins the genealogy. Now, the son of David concept, as we saw, is possibly written into the 3 times 14, the gematria, I don't know how to pronounce that, never did learn, of the Jewish D, 4, 6, and 4 is 14. And so you have David's name bracketed both at the beginning and at the end of the genealogy. And you have Son of David as a title used in Matthew's Gospel. There is a kingship here that's oriented toward the Davidic dynasty. This is going to be important because of the way the eschatology, the Second Temple eschatology, the Hanukkah worldview works out in this with this notion of a Davidic Messiah and how that Messiah is understood in terms of militancy, okay, and the way the end of time is viewed in Matthew's Gospel, and as we'll see in the Hanukkah literature. Okay, so that's one way to look at these texts, is to say Matthew has created these texts, but there's another way to read them, and I just am pointing this out to you. Back in the late 80s, Jane Schauberg wrote a book called The Illegitimacy of Jesus. It's been followed up by a number of books since. I have another one here by Andreas van Aarde called Fatherless in Galilee. Both of these books assert that what the birth narratives are covering up is a rape, that Mary was raped. And Joseph has to do the right thing, and he takes her in, and he knows it's not his child. And one of the things that these writers will do is they will go into the Jewish legends about the birth of Jesus and the rape, that Jesus is a mamzer child, he's an illegitimate child. My friend Bruce Chilton picks up on this in his book, Rabbi Jesus. And I, of course, accepted it in the Jesus-driven life, that Jesus had a mamzer status. He was perceived as a bastard child. He was not perceived as a legitimate child. Even later in his life, the stigma hung on, at least according to the writer of the Gospel of John, when the Jews say to him, we're not illegitimate, and we're not Samaritan either. That's a double smack in Jesus' face. They threw some shade on him at that point. Well, you know, whether or not we have an actual covered up rape here, whether we have Matthew creating the narrative based upon bits and pieces of tradition and then these prophecy fulfillment quotations, what is the point? What is the point here in this narrative? Why does this narrative, Matthew's narrative, begin with this whole Davidic, Abrahamic naming of Jesus, connecting Jesus to these two figures, and carry on with Joseph having these dreams like the patriarchs did in the book of Genesis, placing Jesus in relation to Herod? Because for Matthew, the kingship is everything. Jesus is this king. He's the king of Israel. That's who he is. And this is going to play out through Matthew's gospel all the way. Now, can we say that, no, we're not even in Luke yet, okay? Because Luke is going, you can either use the hypothesis that they have independent traditions, you can, or you can use the Matthew used Luke theory and rewrote Luke, but I prefer the Luke rewrote Matthew theory. It makes, I think it makes better sense. We have a totally different birth narrative in Luke that's focused on Mary. And Joseph is just a byword in that narrative. He's just like, hello, goodbye. You know, it's all about Mary. It's all about Jesus being connected back to Adam. That's very Pauline, isn't it? Adam. Whereas for Matthew, this is connecting Jesus back to Israel's history, David and Abraham. And for the writer of Matthew, it's Jesus' relationship to Israel's history that's important in this birth narrative. Jesus belongs to this history. And so one of the things we want to do when we read these birth narratives is know that these birth narratives are not independent of themselves. They belong to a larger section that goes all the way to chapter 4, verse 17. And it's in chapter 4, verse 17, that we actually find the first major break, or in the next major heading of the gospel that says, from that time Jesus began to preach, saying, and we only have this in Matthew's gospel, and we find it again in chapter 16, verse 21. After there's been this rejection of the kingdom teaching, and after the Caesarea Philippi episode where Jesus wants to know, who do you say I am? Then it says again, from that time Jesus began to teach them, saying, and of course it's the Passion predictions. Well, this is the structure that was discerned by Jack Kingsbury all the way back in 1975, Matthew Structure, Christology, and Kingdom, that we have this division here in the gospel from chapter 1 to 4:16, and then 4:17 to 16:20, and 16:20 on through the end. That's certainly possible. At any rate, how we read this is we're going to want to make sure that we read chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 as contiguous. They belong together. So whatever's going on in chapters 1 and 2 is also going to be influenced and affected by 3 and 4. It doesn't stop. It's not like there's this break and the writer just wants us to go, okay, let's just jump 30 years. No, because what's going to be happening in chapters 3 and 4 is directly related to what happened in 1 and 2. And that's the coming of the Baptist, who appears on the scene out of absolutely nowhere, as in the Gospel of Mark, and also in a sense in the Gospel of John, just boom, unlike Luke, who now has this whole birth narrative around the Baptist that gets included. So we want to keep in mind that this chapters 3 and 4 belong to this introduction, to this where the writer of Matthew is going to be going. And again, part of that is this message of John the Baptist that's really, really quite full of vim and vigor and fire and brimstone and this sort of thing. And we shall certainly see in Matthew's gospel that, yes, he uses Mark's gospel, he also adds a number of these Gehenna sayings and eschatological judgment scenes that Mark does not have, nor does Luke, nor John. Now, one writer who has been the most creative with regard to Matthew's, shall we say, editorial abilities, and actually sees the Gospel of Matthew as just his use of the term is midrash on the Gospel of Mark. That is, most everything in Matthew's made up that's not from Mark. And that's Michael Goulder's midrash election in Matthew. The thing about Goulder's work that's just absolutely excellent is his use of combining statistics. So he goes through and he looks at all the economic metaphors and then all the nature metaphors and these different things, and he's seeing all these connections that are made with Jewish tradition. It's an excellent book as a reference that way, whether or not you want to buy Goulder's thesis, because there are other things to take into consideration when thinking through the Gospel of Matthew, and that's the scribal traditions that would have recorded Jesus' teachings while he was alive. And this is the burden of a book called Reading and Writing in the Time of Jesus, and I think the author's last name is Miller. It's in the other room right now. But there could have been, and this is just, it's a revision of an older thesis by it's the Scandinavian scholars Gerhardsen and I want to say Risenfeld. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It's been a long time since I've read their book on oral tradition and their argument that in fact we're dealing here with a potential scribal tradition, people writing things down. It's possible. I'm not saying it's necessary, I'm saying it's possible. And Matthew may have some of that in his community. And so I don't want to follow Goulder's thesis all the way to the end and say, geez, Matthew's just making all this stuff up. You really have to go pericope by pericope. You have to do all kinds of work on any given text before you start making all those kinds of leaps and bounds. And that's why it's just aggravating when lay people want to jump in the gospel and they'll read a book and read somebody's opinion and go, here it is. No, it's not that simple. It's quite a complex thing. But we've been here now almost 30 minutes, and I'm just trying to show you, I'm trying to open up this large question of the historicity, and is it important? Is it essential? Well, in a sense, there is a yes to this, but in another sense, no. That is, the early church did not seem at all concerned to try and locate, pinpoint, and focus on Jesus' birth. It's just not there in the Pauline letters at all. You do not see that in the Pauline community at all. You do see it, interestingly enough, in the Jerusalem Christian-oriented literature, this focus on Jesus' birth, the Gospel of Matthew, later the Proto-Evangelium of James in the Apocryphal New Testament. Okay, it's possible that the Revelator is referring to this in his chapter 12, but you really, and again, if Luke is using the Hebrew Gospel at this point, and if the Hebrew Gospel has any of this stuff in chapters 1 and 2, maybe there as well, but it's a Jerusalem church-oriented bit of thinking. It doesn't seem to be important at all to the Pauline or the Johannine communities or the Roman community out of which Mark is writing, you see, or wherever he's writing from. It only seems to be significant for Jewish Christianity, and again, this boils down to the way Jesus needs to be understood for Jewish purposes genealogically as the true son of David. And so while the writer is indeed seeking to show the kind of revelatory salvation historical model work that Jesus is doing here in this gospel, it just focuses on the nation of Israel. Of course, it's in Matthew chapter 10, verse 5, where Jesus sends out the 12. He says, go to the house of Israel only. You don't have that limitation in Luke. They go to houses in Samaria, and they're going hither and yon. No, no, no. Jesus and Matthew just to the Jews, not to the Samaritans, just to the Jews. That's Matthew's orientation. It's a very Jewish orientation. Yes, it seems to reflect an openness to the Gentile mission, as scholars have noted, but it's very Jewish. And so we are going to encounter these Jerusalem Christian type themes in Matthew's gospel. We're also going to have to ask a little later on, are certain texts pointed or aimed at Paul and Pauline Christian understandings of Torah? You have to ask that as you work through this gospel. Maybe, does Matthew create sayings, put him in the mouth of Jesus, sayings like, I have not come to destroy the law and prophets, I have come to fulfill them? Is that an authentic Jesus saying, or is it a Matthean bit of redaction, or midrash, if you want to use Goulder's terms? Here's the thing. No matter how you slice it or dice it, when you're done with all of these questions, right? And we've been exploring a lot of them for an hour and a half in these sessions. Where's the text going? What's happening here? And this is where mimetic theoretical reading becomes very, very important. Because yes, you can observe that there are other ancient mythic narratives where gods are born. And this is a story about where the gods are born. Okay? And so we have other ancient Near Eastern myths about the births of the gods. There's a couple of things to keep in mind here. One, the birth of a demigod usually is accompanied by the rape of the mother. The gods aren't kind when they come in the flesh. They just take. Now, there may be some seduction, but it's always going to be male dominated. The male is going to, there's rape involved in many cases. That is something, at least if we read the narrative the way it's written, that is something that is not found at all here. And in fact, the Lucan narrative is going to make very clear what Brad Jersak calls a theology of consent. That is, Mary consents to this. There's no rape. Absolutely not here. And the second piece, again, goes back to Richter's thesis that we're dealing here with the overturning of a theodicy. Here's what becomes really, really fascinating. At the end of the book of Enoch, if you get to chapters 106, 107, and 108 that I've asked you to read, you're going to find a longer, again, a midrash in a way, the way the rabbis or the Jewish writers would add to a story as they told it. And of course, we see this in the Targums. We see it in the Septuagint. Okay, Jews just didn't copy texts. They embellished and added, and they made them relevant for their time. Okay, and that's part of the way the textual tradition develops. But you have Lamech, not the first Lamech after Cain, but down the road you have Lamech, the father of Noah, and he gives birth to Noah. Not he, but his wife gives birth to Noah. And the text reads, his body was white as snow and red as a rose. The hair of his head is white as wool. And his demdema, that's the term that's used, it's partly illegible, is beautiful. And as for his eyes, when he opened them, the whole house glowed like the sun. The whole house glowed even more exceedingly. And when he arose from the hands of the midwife, this little infant, when he comes, he opens his mouth and spoke to the Lord with righteousness. And his father Lamech was afraid of him and fled and went to Methuselah, his father, and said to him, I have begotten a strange son. He's not like an ordinary human being. He looks like the children of the angels of heaven to me. His form is different. He's not like us. His eyes are like the rays of the sun, and his face glorious. Does any of this sound like the book of Revelation to you? Should. It does not seem to me that he's of me, but of angels. And what's Lamech here? He's going all the way back to the book of the Watchers, the first book of Enoch, where the Watchers came and had intercourse with women and produced these monstrous giants in the land. Lamech is saying to his father Methuselah, I got a real problem here because my son is like really, really different, and I don't think that I'm his dad. Now, what Lamech is thinking is that his son has been fathered by an angelic being rather than himself, but he's wrong about that. But he also thinks that the monsters were fathered by these fallen angelic beings, and they weren't. So we go through this whole story of Lamech here, not realizing what Joseph realizes in the text, and that's that his child is birthed by a divine being, but is not a monster. This child, birthed by a divine being, will end this whole Henochic way of relating human and divine, and will end this evil in the world precisely because Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. That's the importance of this narrative for this writer. If you have a Henochic worldview, or people you know are stuck in that worldview where there's a real devil and a real hell, Matthew's narrative is saying it's over, it's done with. The real God has entered into the life of a woman by her consent, and that's again presupposed in Matthew, exposed in Luke. No rape. It's non-violent. And this is important because just like the Genesis 1:1 narrative is a non-violent narrative of creation, so these birth narratives are non-violent birth narratives. That's huge. It's saying something hugely important. And again, if that is not emphasized, then the point of the text is being missed, because God is not like Herod. God doesn't come and take, unlike Herod. God is the giver of life in the text, not the taker of life. There's a direct contrast between the two kings, the one that's born of the Heavenly Father and Herod. And again, if you want, you can point out that the birth of Jesus is a threat to empire. It is a threat to empire. But how is it a threat to empire? Certainly not the way Herod thinks. Herod thinks just like the disciples in the crowds. They would turn Jesus into this militant Messiah, this Davidic warrior Messiah. Perhaps so would the Jerusalem Christians. Hard to say yet, I think. The work needs to be done there. But Matthew's community, like most of Jewish Christianity, has an end time, an eschatological militant Messiah, just as you find in the book of Enoch in the very next chapter, where it's the last piece that's written, and the writer ends this whole compendium of these books. How there's this judgment that's going to be coming, and some are going to end up being put into the fire, and some are going to be children of light, and they're going to be recompensed. This is the term. There's your economy of exchange. They're going to be recompensed. And if you were faithful during tribulation times, you would be recompensed with all this wealth. If you were unfaithful or unrighteous, let me read what will happen to you. They shall see those who were born in the darkness, that is the children of the light. They all get raised, and we're all happy, clappy, and standing in heaven. Then, at that point, we'll see those who were born in darkness being taken into darkness, while the righteous ones shall be resplendent. The sinners shall cry aloud, and they shall see the righteous ones being resplendent. They shall go to the place which was prescribed for them concerning the days and the seasons. And it's not a pretty place. It's full of fire and torment. That's Enoch's worldview. there's a judgment at the end, and the good go to heaven and the bad go to hell. That's the worldview that Jerusalem Christianity was never able to break through, ever. Why? What happened? Well, when you look at the importance of the ethic that's found in all early Christianity, and I've done this to you in a number of videos, when you look at the non-violent, non-retributive, pacifistic ethic found in all the New Testament documents, all of them, if you ask the question, from what particular theological model did Jesus derive this ethic, you will end up in a conundrum. And I used a quote by the great Jewish scholar David Flusser at this point, who said Jesus did not derive his eschatology from his ethic. I'm sorry, Jesus did not derive his ethics from his eschatology. Jesus first discerned love of neighbor and then derived his eschatology from that. If you flip it the other way around, you can only end up with kind of a Niebuhrian approach to eschatology, because you're going to assume that Matthew's approach of recompense is the way to go. And it's not just Niebuhr. You can see this in Miroslav Volf's Exclusion and Embrace, which was a huge hit at the turn of the millennium for clergy, because there Miroslav Volf talks about the eschatological deferral of violence. The reason we're nonviolent now and pacifistic now is because God gets to be brutal in the end, and we trust that. That's the Anabaptist position as well. That is, unlike Jesus, who took his ethics and worked out his eschatology and broke through this Second Temple eschatology, as you see in the historical Jesus, in Mark, in Luke, in the writer of the Gospel of John, who breaks through this. For Paul, for the writer of Paul and John, the apocalyptic event is not this day of recompense and judgment. The apocalyptic day is the crucifixion. That's the apocalypse, is the crucifixion. That's the apocalypse for Paul and John, and for the writer of the Gospel of Mark and Luke as well, although Luke tends to open it up a bit. But it's the cross, but not for Matthew. See, Matthew still has this apocalyptic day of judgment coming. That's part of that worldview. So even though Matthew has the nonviolent ethic in his gospel and is representative of this Jerusalem Christianity, you can see that this tradition has never quite worked out the implications of these ethics for their theology, like you will find in Paul or the writer of the fourth gospel, Mark, etc. So I hope you understand this. So if you have an opportunity, do go read the Book of the Watchers, it's First Enoch, chapters 1 to 36, but especially do read the conclusion here, because if Amy Richter is correct, we do have a bit of a reflection here on the Lamech Joseph characters, the one who thinks his child is born of divine beings, bad angels, but isn't, and the one who knows his child is born of a divine being, but is not, again, it's not a monstrous birth, it's not a sexual taking like it is in the Hanukkah literature. And so how we're going to read this is important, and we absolutely need to read this if we're even going to begin to read it again, through the lens that I think Brad Jerzak's provided, it is a narrative about consent. But it's a narrative in Matthew's gospel that, in a sense, presupposes that and focuses rather on the obedience of Joseph. That's the key here. Every single time Joseph has a dream, he's given a command, and he obeys. And so Joseph is truly a righteous man. He follows the law, the command of God. That's important. In Matthew's gospel, it's important to who Joseph is as a righteous man as well. I'll leave that off here for today. I've got a lot more I want to get into, but I don't want to do that yet. I'll look forward to perhaps the next time I do this. I'm enjoying this. I'm having a lot of fun just reading, thinking, meditating, studying, and then putting these thoughts out there, and I hope they've helped you. If they do, please say they've helped in the comments, and if not, then I can know that I need to go do something else. All right, mates. Peace and love. Hey, everybody. Christopher and Chris Schaefer and Matthew. I see the three of you guys. Peace and love. Hope you have a great day, man. And thanks again for your love and support. Cheers.